Have you ever stopped to wonder how someone in Ireland managed to send a message to someone in Canada in 1866 without a ship carrying a single letter? It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? An ocean nearly 2,000 miles wide is not supposed to cooperate with a strand of wire and electricity. And yet, one of the greatest engineering triumphs in history proved that it could. The project failed. It bankrupted investors, it embarrassed experts, and tempted many people to give up entirely. But then, against nearly every expectation, a handful of determined people changed the world forever. By the end of today's story, I think you'll agree that this achievement deserves to stand beside some of the greatest inventions that humanity has ever produced. Join me today as I uncover the remarkable story of the very first permanent transatlantic telephone cable and how a single wire lying silently beneath the Atlantic Ocean made our modern world completely possible. On July 27th of 1866, something happened that quietly changed all of civilization. There were no cheering stadiums and no grand speeches or spectacles that echoed across the continent, and there were no crowds fully grasping what they were witnessing. Instead, there was a cable stretching from Valentia Island in the rugged west coast of Ireland to the very small harbor of Heart's Content in Newfoundland. At first glance, it hardly sounds revolutionary. After all, it was only a wire, but yet that wire could accomplish something humanity had never done before. It would allow information to travel across an ocean in minutes instead of in weeks. We live in a world where messages circle the globe before we've even finished our morning coffee or finished saying the sentence out loud. We live in a world with cell phones where we can send a text message or a voice message across the world immediately. So it's difficult to appreciate just how astonishing this idea seemed in 1866. To the people of that time, it was as unbelievable as announcing tomorrow's weather from the moon. To understand why this mattered so much, we have to picture the world as it actually was then, not the world as we know it now. Every single important message traveled across the Atlantic aboard a ship, and it took forever. Governments waited for diplomatic news across an entire ocean. Newspapers printed reports that were already weeks old by the time readers were unfolding the pages on the other side of the coast. Merchants gambled fortunes because prices had often changed before the latest information even reached them. Families would celebrate births or mourn deaths long after those moments had already passed. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a stretch of water separating continents. It was a wall that was built with distance and weather and uncertainty and time, and crossing it, well, it required patience because there was simply no alternative, but it was also quite dangerous at the time. It took weeks to be able to travel that kind of a distance, and it took lives pretty regularly. Not so much by the year of 1866, but it did still tend to take a lot of life. So the telegraph had already transformed communications across land. Electrical signals would race through these wires that were connecting towns and cities with absolutely astonishing speeds, proving that messages no longer had to travel at the pace of a horse or the pace of a ship. That success naturally inspired an ambitious question. If a wire could cross mountains and rivers and forests, why not an ocean? Well, the answer appeared painfully obvious to pretty much everyone. In fact, today, people still think, what are you talking about? Oceans are deep and violent and unforgiving and full of water. And that doesn't necessarily get along with electronics, does it? If you ever dropped your phone in the toilet, I won't go into how many times it's happened to me, but not a good thing. So the Atlantic alone stretches for literally thousands of miles. with storms capable of tossing enormous ships like they're nothing more than driftwood. Somewhere beneath those waters lay mountains and valleys in crushing pressure, like things that you can't even begin to imagine, unlike anything engineers had ever challenged before, too. It sounded less like an engineering project and far more like the beginning of an expensive disappointment. Well, one man refused to let that answer stand. His name was Cyrus Westfield. Two separate words there, not Westfield, but Westfield, and was not an engineer by training. So Cyrus, he possessed the sort of determination that often makes impossible ideas dangerous to dismiss. He gathered scientists and financiers and engineers who all believed that the Atlantic could be crossed by something far smaller than just a ship. Their plan required manufacturing thousands of miles of cable that could remain waterproof, flexible, electrically reliable, and strong enough to survive being lowered into the deepest parts of the ocean without snapping beneath its own weight. Remember the atmospheres of pressure underwater. Even if they succeeded in laying this cable, another unsettling question remained. Would the electric signal actually survive such an enormous journey? Nobody could answer that with certainty because nobody had ever attempted anything remotely like this yet. Sometimes the greatest leap forward begins with one admitting that no one knows whether the next step is even going to hold. Then an unexpected discovery gave the dreamers and the dream its first real chance. Years of painstaking ocean surveys had revealed something quite remarkable hidden beneath the Atlantic. Instead of endless jagged peaks and impossible cliffs, much of the route between Ireland and Newfoundland followed a broad underwater plateau that was comparatively smooth. It became known as the telegraph plateau for obvious reasons, and suddenly the ocean looked just a little less impossible. Nature had just provided a pathway where no one had expected one. Even so, no amount of favorable geography could erase the risks ahead. The cable still had to survive thousands of open miles of sea, an endless tension at being unrolled from a moving ship and conditions no human invention had ever endured. Remember, this is less than a year after the American Civil War had just ended. Everyone involved understood that one mistake could send months of work and millions of dollars to the bottom of the Atlantic. And remember, the inflation rates. In 1866, millions of dollars would have been multiple billions today. So the first attempts seemed to confirm everyone's pretty much their skeptic predictions. Early cables snapped during the laying process, or they failed soon after they began carrying the messages. In 1858, one cable briefly connected Europe and North America, allowing Queen Victoria herself to send a congratulatory telegram to President James Buchanan. It should have been the beginning of a new era, but instead, the cable failed after only a few weeks when excessive electrical voltage damaged its insulation beyond repair. Investors lost their confidence. Newspapers questioned whether the entire undertaking had been just a little more than an elaborate fantasy. For many people, the Atlantic had delivered its verdict. Some obstacles, they concluded, simply were just not meant to be conquered. Yet the men behind the project had learned something that failure often teaches better than success does. They now understood exactly what had gone wrong, and they were preparing to make one final attempt that would either change the world forever or bury the dream completely beneath the sea for good. So the task before the engineers in 1866 demanded something that no one had ever accomplished. The enormous steamship, the Great Eastern, was the largest ship in the world at the time. It carried thousands of miles of carefully manufactured cable, was coiled inside of its hull like an impossibly large spool of thread, waiting like a snake. As the vessel slowly crossed the Atlantic, the cable slipped steadily over the stern and disappeared beneath the waves. There was no opportunity to receive it or retrieve it, or if anything happened to go wrong. Every mile that entered that entered the ocean, it represented more money and more hope and more uncertainty settling on the seabed. All these people had invested so much into this project. Men were watching gauges constantly and measuring the tension with anxious precision, because too much strain could snap the cable in an instant, while too little might allow it to tangle beyond any kind of sense of recovery. They were laying not just a wire, but an entirely new way for the world to communicate. When the Great Eastern finally reached Heart's Content in Newfoundland on July 27th of 1866, the moment itself was surprisingly quiet, pretty calm. There was no explosion of celebration, no triumphant orchestra waiting on the shoreline. Instead, there was something far more remarkable. The electrical signals worked. Messages traveled clearly from Ireland to Newfoundland and back again. After years of disappointment and ridicule and broken cables and staggering financial losses, the Atlantic Ocean had finally been crossed by electricity. Imagine living in a world where news from another continent had always arrived weeks late, if not months, only to discover that from this day forward, it would arrive while you were still standing in the same place. It would arrive instantly. Entire governments suddenly had access to information that once seemed pretty much impossibly distant. The engineers accomplished something almost unbelievable. Rather than simply celebrating their success, they sailed back into the Atlantic and searched for the broken cable that had failed the previous year. Somewhere beneath thousands of feet of water lay a damaged line that most people considered lost forever. But using specifically designed grappling hooks and practice that bordered on stubbornness, a lot of stubbornness, and an extraordinary amount of skill, they managed to locate it, raise it from the ocean floor, repair it aboard the ship, and complete a second working transatlantic cable. One successful connection would have changed history, but two transformed it beyond anyone's expectations. What had begun as an experiment was rapidly becoming a dependable communication system linking two separate continents from thousands of miles away. The impact reached much farther and much faster than telegrams. Governments could respond to international crises while the events were still unfolding instead of reaching weeks later. Financial markets became far more stable because prices no longer drifted across oceans at the speed of sailing ships. Newspapers began reporting events that were actually current and still happening, rather than historical by the time their readers unfolded the pages later on. Scientists also benefited in a way that few people could anticipate. Precise timing signals exchanged through the cable dramatically improved longitude measurements between Europe and North America. It was making navigation safer and more accurate. A single strand beneath the Atlantic, between the two continents, changed diplomacy, commerce, navigation, journalism, even scientific understanding all at once. Few inventions have ever carried so much influence while retaining and remaining completely invisible almost. The cable reminded everyone that the world was a little bit smaller than what they may have originally thought. But the cable remained in operation for generations, and more soon followed. Valentia Island became one of the world's most important communication hubs there in Ireland, while Heart's Content grew into an essential gateway between Europe and North America. For 100 years, cables continued operating from Valentia until the final cable service ended in 1966, exactly 100 years after the first permanent success. Today, visitors can still stand at those remarkable places in Heart's Content or Valentia Island and imagine the moment when the world suddenly became so much smaller The wire itself has long since been replaced by fiber optics and satellites and digital networks, and yet every email, every text message, every video call can still trace their ancestry back to that determined group of engineers who refused to believe that an ocean was just too wide to cross. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson of all is that the permanent transatlantic telegraph cable did not conquer the Atlantic by making the ocean any smaller. It conquered it by making humanity and human ingenuity larger. The people behind the project never saw things like smartphones or the internet or instant video calls, but they built the first permanent bridge that allowed information to travel faster than transportation itself could. They proved that the greatest distance can sometimes be overcome with the simplest ideas, and proved that enough courage and persistence are wrapped around it. Looking back, it's remarkable that the longest connection in history began with a single wire that refused to lose its current. So let me ask you this. If you could travel back to the year 1866, just as you are now, and send just one telegraph message across the Atlantic, knowing it would be one of the first instant text messages ever exchanged between continents, what would you say and who would you say it to? What would your message to the world be? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, please make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. I have been shadow banned recently, and anything and everything that you can do helps me tremendously. Thank you for watching.